Imagine standing in a room full of family and friends, celebrating 16 years of marriage, only to have your entire life ripped apart in a matter of minutes. A single revelation, carefully planned and executed, turns a joyous anniversary into a nightmare. But what if that betrayal was only the beginning? What if the truth ran deeper than anyone could have imagined? Tonight, one man exposes the ultimate deception, and what follows will change everything. Ryan Whitmore stood in the grand kitchen of his suburban home, meticulously arranging an array of appetizers on a polished silver tray. His movements were deliberate, almost surgical in their precision. Every slice of cheese, every carefully placed olive, was arranged with the control of a man accustomed to order. To the casual observer, he appeared calm, a devoted husband preparing for a milestone anniversary celebration. But beneath the composed exterior, a storm raged, one that had been brewing for 16 years. 16 years of deception. 16 years of betrayal, carefully hidden beneath the facade of a perfect marriage. The realization sent a tremor through his hand, nearly knocking over the wine glass he had poured but had no intention of drinking. He steadied himself, inhaling slowly. No one in this house, neither his wife nor his children, nor the guests soon to arrive, had any inkling of what was coming. A voice pulled him from his thoughts. His eldest son, Caleb, stood in the doorway, holding a bundle of party streamers. At 15, he was tall and lanky, his limbs struggling to keep up with his rapid growth. Ryan studied him for a moment, his stomach twisting. How much of himself did he see in the boy, and how much of that resemblance was just wishful thinking? "Along the staircase," he finally answered, his voice even. Caleb nodded and hurried off, nearly bumping into his younger sister, Ava, who emerged from the living room. At 13, she had already mastered the art of teenage exasperation, rolling her eyes as she sidestepped her brother's hurried movements. She held up a handmade banner, its glittery letters proclaiming happy anniversary. "Mom, Dad." Ryan forced a smile, nodding approvingly. "Your mother will love it," he assured her, though the words felt empty. Ava beamed and rushed away to hang the decoration, blissfully unaware of the truth lurking beneath the surface of their picture-perfect evening. A small voice spoke next. His youngest, 8-year-old Jonah, peeked around the corner, a deflated balloon in one hand. "Can I blow up more balloons, Dad?" Ryan swallowed the lump in his throat. "Go ahead, buddy," he said, his voice tighter than he intended. "Just don't get too dizzy." The sounds of celebration preparations filled the house, the rustling of decorations, the excited chatter of his children, the occasional laughter from the backyard where the final party arrangements were underway. It was the soundtrack of a family united, a family bound by love and trust. At least that was the illusion. Ryan returned to his task, ensuring that everything was flawless. Every detail had been planned to perfection, every contingency considered. He had spent months orchestrating this moment, making sure that when the truth finally emerged, there would be no escape for Elena. The doorbell chimed, the first of many guests arriving. Ryan straightened his tie, exhaling deeply as he set down the tray and turned toward the front door. The time for hesitation was over. The stage was set. As he moved through the growing crowd, shaking hands and exchanging warm smiles, his ears remained attuned to one particular conversation. He didn't have to wait long. "I swear, Elena is always off on another trip with that colleague of hers," a woman murmured, her voice hushed but not nearly quiet enough. "Another conference next month, isn't it? What's his name again?" "Marcus," her companion chuckled. "Must be nice. If I had to choose between a husband constantly buried in work and frequent trips to luxury hotels with a charming coworker, I know what I'd pick." Ryan's jaw tightened, but his expression remained as smooth as ever. He had heard variations of this conversation for months, carefully worded observations, insinuations spoken just loudly enough to be overheard. It didn't matter anymore. By the end of the night, rumors would no longer be necessary. His gaze traveled across the room, scanning the faces of seemingly unremarkable guests. A man in a dark suit, nervously stirring his drink. A woman with piercing green eyes, glancing at her watch as if waiting for something. A broad-shouldered figure standing near the fireplace, laughing a little too loudly at a joke he barely seemed to register. To anyone else, they were just part of the crowd. Acquaintances, colleagues, friends of friends. But to Ryan, they were the last pieces of his carefully constructed plan. And then she arrived. Elena stepped through the doorway, a vision of elegance in a black gown that shimmered under the warm glow of the chandeliers. A picture of confidence, charm, and effortless grace. As she moved through the crowd, offering polite smiles and warm embraces, Ryan caught her gaze. For the briefest moment, he saw something flicker in her eyes. Hesitation, perhaps even unease. Good. Let her wonder. The night was still young, and the real celebration had yet to begin. The evening unfolded effortlessly, filled with warmth, laughter, and the soft clinking of glasses. Ryan Whitmore moved through the crowd, his presence commanding but unassuming, his expression a perfect blend of gratitude and quiet pride. He shook hands, exchanged pleasantries, and accepted well wishes for what everyone believed was a joyous milestone. Elena played her role flawlessly, as she always had. Her radiant smile, her poised demeanor, the effortless charm with which she spoke to guests. It was the same performance she had given for years. Her hand occasionally brushed against Ryan's, a delicate gesture of unity, as if reaffirming the image they had so carefully constructed. The deception was seamless, and no one suspected the truth lurking beneath the surface. Ryan observed it all with the sharp detachment of a man watching a stage play he had seen too many times before. Every movement, every word from her lips, felt rehearsed. He had spent months unraveling the truth behind the act, piecing together the lies, preparing for this moment. From his position near the fireplace, he surveyed the room, eyes drifting toward their children. Caleb, Ava, and Jonah stood together, caught up in the excitement of the evening, unaware of the weight hanging in the air. The sight of them sent an unfamiliar pang through him, something between grief and fury. He had devoted himself to them, guided them, protected them, only to discover that the very foundation of his role as their father was built on a lie. At last, the moment arrived. The gentle chime of metal against glass cut through the conversations, drawing the attention of every guest. Conversations hushed, heads turned, and an expectant silence settled over the room. Ryan, ever composed, let the pause stretch for a beat longer than necessary, ensuring that all eyes remained on him. He spoke with practiced ease, his words carefully measured, his tone warm yet controlled. Expressions of gratitude flowed naturally, acknowledgments of support, appreciation for loved ones, reflections on the journey of marriage and family. The guests listened, some nodding, others smiling in agreement. Elena stood beside him, her presence unwavering, her eyes shining with what appeared to be sincerity. For a moment, she seemed completely at ease, as if unaware of the undercurrents shifting beneath the surface. Then, with the same deliberate grace, Ryan turned his attention toward their children. His words shifted seamlessly, carrying a different weight now, one that held meaning only he understood. The night, he explained, was not only a celebration of marriage but of family, of the bonds that connected them. A few guests chuckled as he produced 3 elegantly wrapped boxes, handing one to each child. Their expressions brightened with surprise, their excitement palpable. The crowd watched with interest, their attention drawn to the moment unfolding before them. As the ribbons unraveled and the wrapping paper fell away, the change in atmosphere was subtle at first. The enthusiasm on Caleb's face faltered. Ava's brows drew together, a flicker of confusion replacing her earlier excitement. Jonah, still too young to recognize the shift, tilted his head, studying the unfamiliar object in his hands. Recognition dawned slowly, first in Caleb's eyes, then in Ava's, and finally even in Jonah's. The neatly packaged DNA testing kits lay exposed before them, their meaning sinking in with chilling clarity. A ripple of unease moved through the guests, quiet murmurs breaking the silence. Some exchanged glances, others turned toward Ryan, waiting for an explanation. Elena's posture stiffened beside him, her fingers curling against her side. Her carefully composed mask didn't break immediately, but there was a tension in her stance now, an awareness that something was terribly wrong. Ryan, still calm, gestured for the children to look further. With hesitant fingers, they reached inside their boxes once more, pulling out what lay beneath. Photographs. Ava's breath hitched first. Caleb's shoulders tensed. Jonah blinked at the image in his small hands. A man's face staring back at him, unfamiliar yet somehow significant. And then, in a voice that carried through the room with quiet finality, Ryan revealed the truth. A sharp, collective inhale passed through the guests. The murmurs turned into hushed exclamations. The weight of the revelation crashed over the gathering, heavy and unrelenting. Elena's reaction was immediate. Her carefully measured exterior finally cracked, disbelief and horror flickering across her face. A step backward, a sharp breath, a desperate attempt to reclaim control of a situation that had long slipped from her grasp. The children remained frozen in place. Caleb clenched his fists, his expression darkening. Ava's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Jonah looked up at them all, confusion clouding his young features, seeking reassurance where none could be found. The weight of the moment settled in the air, thick and suffocating. The guests, some too stunned to react, others already shifting uneasily toward the exits, bore witness to the slow, excruciating unraveling of the family they had gathered to celebrate. Elena finally found her voice, but it was raw, unsteady, laced with something between panic and rage. The words that spilled from her lips carried accusations, desperate attempts to turn the blame elsewhere. But her voice was drowned out by the undeniable weight of evidence, by the reality now staring her in the face. The truth no longer required an explanation. It was there, in the way Caleb's expression hardened, in the way Ava clutched the photograph with trembling fingers, in the way Jonah's small shoulders curled inward as he processed what he could not fully comprehend. And in the end, it was there in the way Ryan remained unmoved, the finality of his revelation needing no further confirmation. The illusion shattered, and the fallout had only just begun. The house, once filled with warmth and celebration, had turned into a battleground of silence and broken illusions. The guests, unsettled by the shocking revelation, trickled out one by one, some offering murmured condolences, others too stunned to meet anyone's gaze. The remnants of the party, half-empty glasses, discarded napkins, and the shimmering anniversary banner still hanging above the fireplace, felt grotesque in the heavy stillness that followed. Ryan Whitmore stood in the center of it all, an unmoving figure amidst the wreckage of the life he had spent years constructing. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, but there was no room for doubt. The truth, no matter how painful, had to be revealed. Elena had collapsed onto the couch, her carefully styled hair now disheveled, her dress crumpled in a way that mirrored her unraveling composure. Her fingers gripped the photograph she had snatched from Jonah's trembling hands, her knuckles white as if holding on to it could undo the damage already done. She had spent years crafting a lie so perfect that even she had started to believe it. Now, stripped of her illusions, she was nothing more than a woman who had lost everything. The children had retreated to the staircase, forming a huddled mass of uncertainty. Caleb, standing rigid, stared down at the DNA test kit still clenched in his fist. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the storm raging beneath his carefully maintained mask. Ava sat next to him, her face pale, her hands gripping the railing as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Jonah, the youngest, curled into himself, confusion shadowing his wide eyes. He understood only fragments of what had transpired, but the energy in the room was enough to tell him that something had been irreparably broken. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Then, without warning, Caleb turned on his heel and stormed up the stairs, the sharp sound of his footsteps breaking the stillness. Ava hesitated, casting one last glance at her parents before following him, her movements slower, more hesitant. Jonah remained frozen for a moment longer before dragging himself up after them, his small frame seeming even smaller in the vast, empty space of the home. Elena inhaled sharply, as if their departure had physically struck her. The weight of their absence settled heavily on her shoulders, crushing the last remnants of defiance she had left. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual charm. Ryan didn't respond. There was nothing to say. He had spent months preparing for this, had replayed every possible reaction in his mind. But nothing had prepared him for the reality of watching his children retreat into a world of betrayal they never should have had to know. The fallout extended beyond the walls of their home. The next morning, the story had spread. Neighbors whispered behind drawn curtains, co-workers exchanged knowing glances in office hallways, and before long, the media caught wind of the scandal. What had once been a private catastrophe now belonged to the public. Ryan arrived at the hospital, where he had spent years building a reputation as a respected surgeon, only to be met with wary stares and hushed conversations that ceased the moment he walked into a room. The chief of surgery, Dr. Malcolm Shaw, called him into his office, his expression grim. There was no discussion, no sympathy. The board had already convened. Ryan was placed on immediate administrative leave. Not because of his skills, not because of any failure in his work, but because the scandal had turned him into a liability. Patients were requesting new surgeons. Colleagues no longer knew how to look at him without seeing the tabloid headlines in their minds. Back at the house, Elena faced her own reckoning. Her law firm, built on the foundation of trust and discretion, had little patience for public disgrace. Her managing partner, a man who had once praised her ability to maintain control in high-stakes cases, now looked at her with barely concealed disappointment. She was placed on indefinite suspension pending an internal ethics review. The walls were closing in, but none of it compared to the collapse within their own home. Caleb, once the responsible eldest son who had prided himself on maturity beyond his years, refused to look at either of his parents. He left the house early, returning late, his silence heavier than any words he could have spoken. Ava, who had once found solace in long conversations with her mother, no longer sought her out. She drifted through the house like a shadow, existing but not present. Jonah, too young to process the full extent of what had happened, asked the questions neither of his siblings dared to voice. But his voice, once bright with childhood innocence, now held an edge of caution. Ryan watched it all unfold, knowing there was no way to undo the damage. He had torn apart the illusion, but he had also shattered something far more fragile, the trust of the children he had raised. Elena made one last attempt to salvage what remained. She approached Ryan late one evening, when the house was dark and quiet, when the weight of everything felt the heaviest. Her voice, raw from too many sleepless nights, barely rose above a whisper. He didn't answer, not because he didn't hear her, but because there was nothing left to save. The truth had been set free, and with it, their family had crumbled into something unrecognizable. The aftermath of the revelation was like a wildfire, spreading beyond the confines of their once private world. What had begun as a single moment of reckoning at an anniversary party had evolved into a relentless storm of consequences. The betrayal, now public knowledge, took on a life of its own, devouring whatever remained of their fragile stability. Ryan Whitmore moved through his days in a state of quiet detachment. His leave from the hospital had given him ample time to think, though thinking brought no comfort. The silence in the house was heavier than ever, the weight of the fallout pressing down on all of them. His children remained distant, lost in their own fractured realities. Caleb, once a responsible and composed young man, had become unreachable, his anger simmering beneath a surface of forced indifference. He avoided his parents entirely, his once open and thoughtful conversations now reduced to brief, empty acknowledgments. Ava had retreated into herself, the vibrant spark she once carried dimmed by confusion and hurt. Jonah, still too young to fully grasp the betrayal, struggled the most. One day seeking comfort, the next lashing out in frustration, trying to make sense of a world that no longer felt safe. Elena, despite her initial shock, had not surrendered. If anything, she had begun to fight back. Ryan had expected her to crumble under the weight of the truth, but instead, She had reassembled the broken pieces into something sharp and dangerous. Within days of the scandal, she had hired one of the most ruthless attorneys in the city. She framed herself not as the deceiver, but as the victim of a calculated humiliation. She painted Ryan as a man obsessed with control, someone who had let his paranoia dictate his actions, someone willing to destroy his own family for the sake of a grudge. Her strategy was as cruel as it was effective. In the court of public opinion, the truth didn't matter as much as the story people were willing to believe. Ryan, once respected, now found himself under scrutiny. What kind of man humiliates his own children in front of an audience? What father turns a personal betrayal into a public execution? The legal battle began with a quiet threat. Elena was filing for sole custody. Ryan read the notice in silence, his grip tightening around the paper as the full weight of her attack settled over him. This wasn't just about a marriage ending. She wanted to sever the last ties between him and the children he had raised. The claim was simple but devastating. Ryan had acted with emotional cruelty, weaponizing their children in a public spectacle. She argued that his behavior proved he was unstable, unfit to provide the stability they needed. She cited the growing distance between him and the children, the media scrutiny that now followed their every step, the way their family had collapsed under his actions. The accusations were strategic. They weren't about the truth. They were about perception. Ryan, however, refused to play her game. He had no intention of fighting her in the public eye, of turning this into another spectacle. He gathered his own legal team, determined to keep the battle where it belonged, within the courtroom. But while the legal war waged in quiet meetings and court filings, another, darker thread was beginning to unravel beneath the surface. Elena had always been meticulous in her deception, careful to cover her tracks, but Ryan's revelation had forced cracks into her carefully constructed life. And as the pressure mounted, some of those cracks began to widen. The financial records were the first sign that something was wrong. Ryan had not initially paid attention to their accounts. After all, what did it matter now? But then the discrepancies began to surface. Unexplained transfers, large withdrawals from joint assets, irregularities that should not have existed. And then there was the hospital. A former colleague, someone who still believed in him despite the scandal, reached out with something disturbing. A quiet warning. A whisper of rumors that had begun circulating within the administrative offices. Allegations of financial mismanagement. Research funds unaccounted for. A connection between Elena and another doctor, Dr. Marcus Hale, the same man whose name had been whispered at their anniversary party, the same man who had been part of her many so-called business trips. It was all starting to make sense. The lies were not just personal. They were professional. Elena's infidelity had not been limited to their marriage. It had bled into her work, into her finances, into something much bigger than Ryan had ever imagined. He began to dig deeper, pulling at the threads she had tried so carefully to keep hidden. What he found was damning. Transactions traced back to accounts connected to Dr. Hale. Unauthorized expenses buried within corporate reports. Subtle, calculated manipulations of hospital research funding. Nothing large enough to be obvious, but enough to raise questions. Ryan knew he had a choice. He could use this information against her in the custody battle, strengthening his case. Or he could take it to the hospital, to the authorities, exposing her for more than just a liar. But then something else happened. Patient died. It was a high-profile case, an elderly businessman scheduled for what should have been a routine operation. The surgery had been successful, but the post-operative medication had unexpected complications. Within hours, the patient's condition deteriorated. Within a day, he was gone. The investigation began quietly, but Ryan knew how hospitals worked. He knew that when complications arose, when lawsuits loomed, people started asking questions. And then one night, a nurse approached him. She was hesitant, nervous, her eyes darting toward the shadows of the hospital parking lot. She told him that she had seen something. Dr. Hale in the pharmacy after hours, accessing restricted medications. She had dismissed it at first, assuming it was nothing. But then, after the patient's death, After whispers of an autopsy report that hinted at unusual medication levels, she began to wonder. Ryan listened carefully, his mind racing. The implications were staggering. If Dr. Hale had tampered with the medication, then this was no longer just about fraud. It was something much darker. Elena, in her desperation to maintain her carefully controlled life, had aligned herself with a man who might be capable of far more than an affair. Ryan knew then that his fight with her was no longer just about their children. It was about something bigger, something that went beyond betrayal and custody battles. It was about justice. And as he watched the hospital lights flicker against the dark night sky, he made his decision. He would expose everything. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but once set in motion, they were impossible to stop. The evidence Ryan Whitmore had uncovered was enough to dismantle everything Elena had fought to protect. Her deception had extended far beyond their marriage, reaching into places where the consequences were no longer just emotional but legal. The hospital launched an internal investigation, one that quickly escalated beyond its walls. Financial audits revealed irregularities in research funding, and quiet whispers of professional misconduct turned into full-scale inquiries. But the most damning revelation came from the autopsy report of the deceased patient. Toxicology results confirmed suspicions. Unauthorized medications had been administered post-surgery. A fatal dose, carefully disguised as a routine prescription. The moment that information reached the right hands, the case ceased to be about malpractice. It became criminal. Dr. Marcus Hale, the man whose name had first surfaced in hushed conversations at an anniversary party, was the first to break. When faced with potential charges of medical negligence and involuntary manslaughter, he did what desperate men always did. He looked for a way out. He named names. Elena's involvement in the financial discrepancies was undeniable, but it was Hale's testimony that placed her at the center of a far more dangerous game. Emails, deleted but retrieved by forensic analysts, painted a clear picture of a partnership built on more than just an affair. Funds had been siphoned from research grants, hidden in accounts connected to Hale. And when scrutiny threatened their stability, risks had been taken. A single patient had become collateral damage in their web of lies. Arrests followed. Elena was charged with financial fraud, conspiracy to commit medical malpractice, and obstruction of justice. Hale faced additional charges of medical negligence leading to death. The legal system was relentless, and while neither had intended for things to spiral this far, intent mattered little when lives had been lost. Ryan sat in the back of the courtroom the day Elena's bail was denied. She looked smaller than he had ever seen her, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. For years, she had controlled the narrative of their lives, manipulated perception to serve her needs. Now she had no control left. The custody battle ended before it truly began. The moment the charges were filed, Elena lost all legal ground to fight for the children. Her attorneys withdrew, and the petition for sole custody was quietly dismissed. There was no courtroom confrontation, no last-minute speech. Just a signed agreement, a legal acknowledgement that she had forfeited her right to be a mother in every way that mattered. But even with legal victories, the damage was not easily undone. The children remained fractured, struggling to process not only the deception but the depth of their mother's actions. Caleb, once furious with Ryan, had turned that anger inward, blaming himself for not seeing the truth sooner. Ava, ever the observer, vacillated between grief and indifference, unwilling to acknowledge how much the revelations had wounded her. Jonah, still young, struggled to separate the mother he had known from the woman now sitting in a jail cell. Ryan gave them time. There were no forced conversations, no expectations of immediate reconciliation. He understood that trust, once broken, did not mend overnight. He moved through each day with quiet patience, waiting for the moment when his children would reach for him, rather than him pulling them back. When it finally happened, it was subtle. One evening, Caleb lingered in the kitchen longer than usual, his shoulders tense but his presence deliberate. He didn't speak much, but he didn't leave immediately either. Ava, always cautious with her emotions, started asking quiet questions. Not about the past, but about the future. Jonah, in his childlike way, simply sat beside Ryan on the couch, unprompted, as if seeking a reassurance that words couldn't provide. Healing was slow, but it had begun. Months later, the legal battles were over. Elena was convicted, sentenced to years behind bars with no possibility of early release. Hale, though equally responsible, received a lighter sentence in exchange for his cooperation, a betrayal that sealed any possibility of loyalty between them. With the past finally behind him, Ryan made one final decision. Boston. The offer from St. Vincent's Trauma Center had come weeks before, a position that offered not only professional redemption but the chance for a fresh start. For the first time in months, the idea of leaving didn't feel like running. It felt like something else entirely, like rebuilding. The children agreed, though not with enthusiasm. It wasn't excitement, but it wasn't resistance either. It was understanding. On the morning of their departure, Ryan stood in the empty living room of the house he had once called home. The walls, now bare, held memories both good and bad, but they no longer carried weight. He had done what needed to be done. As he stepped outside, where his children waited in the car, he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, moments of doubt, but they would face them together. As a family,